we're super excited to dive into biogenic CO2 today. This has been a hot topic and shameless plug for Jeff and I. We were in Europe 4 months ago for the European CO2 Summit, and we were fortunate enough to have a conversation with Gas World there. And we focused a lot on biogenic CO2. Yeah. It's very prominent in Europe, but here in North America, it's just starting to catch on. And with us today is Patrick Serfass, the Executive Director of the American Biogas Council, and he is going to educate us in the trends that they are seeing in the shift from just focusing on that biogas and the RNG to now CO2 kind of becoming synonymous in that conversation. So Patrick, really excited to have you on and have your representation today. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
Awesome.
Yeah, I look forward to it. I think maybe the best starting place is let's define for everybody what biogenic CO2 is. And like you said, in Europe, it's becoming a commonplace nomenclature a little bit and known entity of in the supply of CO2. But in the U.S., still not very much known of what it is because we're just not capturing it today, which is a real opportunity in the market. So yeah, maybe break down for us, what is biogenic CO2 in your definition?
Yeah, I mean it's CO2 that's derived biologically. So instead of pulling it out of the air or otherwise separating gases to be able to get to CO2, it comes from some kind of biological source. And since all biogas comes from biomass and is made naturally using microbes, that makes any CO2 that you take from biogas biogenic.
That's interesting. I think, we're so accustomed to our CO2 sources coming from underground, from fracking, and so you're pulling this already trapped CO2. While the biogenic side, it's just naturally occurring the decomposition, as you say, Patrick, and organisms re-releasing that CO2 as they break down. Kind of circular economy,
absolutely,
which we find to be very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think the two core biogenic sources today would be landfills and waste, farm waste, dairy waste, things like that. Is there other markets for production that you're seeing, or would those be the core? Really, when we're talking about this, we're already capturing the renewable natural gas, which is the crux of your group and your membership. That's really what you're focused on, is that RNG, renewable natural gas. But with that also comes this standardized CO2 coming out with it. So yeah, is there other sources other than those two that you focus on, or are those the key ones?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you mention landfill and farm-based waste, what I'm hearing is the biogas from those sources, right? And biogas is 60% methane. That's where all the energy is, and 40% carbon dioxide. And so that's what we care about for the biogenic CO2. And biogas is made from any organic material that you put into a tank or some kind of closed area like a landfill, and you starve it of oxygen. And then all the microbes that are already present in that material digest and decompose the organic material. And as the microbes do that, the microbes give off biogas. And so landfills are a source of biogas. Farms with manure or other agricultural waste, those are a source of biogas. And then we would generally, if we kind of go down the road of separating by feedstocks, there's really two other main categories, and that's food waste and wastewater facilities. So when you get sewage that comes into a wastewater facility, the job of the wastewater facility is to pull out all the solids, all the sludge, and so you can put clean water back into the waterways. What do you do with that sludge? Well, you can recycle it, make biogas from it, put the nutrients back into the soil, so you recycle those, and from the biogas, then you can use something with the methane, and you can do something with the CO2. When you talk about renewable natural gas, that's basically just the pure methane part of renewable natural gas. You take everything else out of the biogas, you're left with pure methane. We call it renewable natural gas because it's indistinguishable from conventional gas, except for it's been renewably made. Just like the CO2 side is indistinguishable from the CO2 that you might pull out of the ground, except for it's been renewably or biogenically made. And so this is really like one of the greatest things that can happen because the industry's already developed to use the methane. We all know how to use natural gas, and making it renewable is great. And so developing the markets to use the CO2, absolutely. Why shouldn't we do that from an economic standpoint and an environmental standpoint?
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. So maybe kind of let's put some quantification to this a little bit. Like you said, RNG, renewable natural gas, the methane capture, basically, which is displacing the demand or need for fossil-based natural gas to be pulled out of the earth and then used. Um, how many installations are there? What percentage of the potential market are we capturing that methane today, whether it's landfills or farm waste, water treatment facilities? And then the secondary question would be, of those, like you said, it's 60% methane, 40% CO2. Of those facilities that you note, what percentage, what number of those capture CO2 in the US today?
All right, so across the United States, we have 2,300 operational biogas plants, and they range all kinds of different sizes, but they're generally on farms, at landfills, at wastewater plants, or at food waste plants. The biggest number is at the wastewater facilities. There's about a little over 1,000 biogas systems at wastewater facilities, and then it's relatively evenly distributed between farms, landfills, and food scrap only facilities. But that probably represents, it's definitely less than 20% of the market. It might be as low as 13% of the market. And when you look at what is the total market size, it's all the organic waste. It's all the manure that we produce, all the food waste that we produce, all the sludge that we need to take out of our wastewater to clean that up, and then all the gas from landfills. But we have a lot of all of those things because we have a lot of people, we have a lot of animals that we raise to make food, and that all produces waste. And so, what do we do with that? We can either compost it or digest it in biogas systems, or we can do both with it. So, we see at least 15,000 new systems that could be built, maybe even more than that. So 2,300 now, at least 15,000 new systems. I'm not sure I know more than 5 facilities that are beneficially reusing their CO2 today, actually doing that. It's a very, very small number. But one of the exciting things about it, and one of the reasons I'm glad we're able to talk about it, is because that's starting to change very quickly because the whole market for CO2 is in the process of changing. And I think that creates some concern on the buyer side for CO2, but it also creates a lot of opportunity for both the buyers and the sellers. Certainly, opportunities for the sellers of CO2 to be able to sell it, but also on the buyer side to be able to lower the carbon footprint of whatever you're making with the CO2 with a lower carbon footprint CO2. And so opportunity abounds, and but it is just getting started.
Yeah.
As you talk through carbon footprint, let's unpack that a little bit as it pertains to the revenues generated by these biogas facilities. So, you know, right now the monetization is on that RNG and selling the RNG, but we know that there are tax credits that tie to CI score. Obviously, the CO2 itself as a revenue stream. What does capturing CO2 unpack? I mean, when we talk about 17,000 installations and 5 of them being captured, the future of 17,000 for the total market, how do we start to see 5 turning to 500 to 5,000? What's the argument for the capture of CO2 as it pertains to revenue generation?
Well, yeah, it's really the basic economics of the situation are, can you generate enough revenue from whatever the biogas system is selling to be able to pay for its capital costs? And so right now, when you look at the 2,300 that have been built already, that's where you have a lot of waste in one particular place that can therefore produce a lot of biogas. And right now, only really the methane portion of that biogas is getting monetized. And so you sell enough of the methane molecules, usually to replace natural gas in the form of electricity or vehicle fuel or something like that, and get those developed. But you could build systems a lot faster if you could also monetize the CO2 as well. And that is like we mentioned, that's barely being done. And so once you do that, then that creates a lot more opportunity for construction and investment, but also for environmental protection. Because right now, all the waste that's going in, that would be going into those 15,000 new systems, it is not being recycled. We looked recently at all of the food waste, or just the food waste the post-consumer food waste in the United States. We just looked at this last month and put out a short report on it. And if you add all the composting and all the biogas facilities that are recycling post-consumer food waste, so that's the food waste after it's gone to people, it's only 14%. That's a really, really small number. And so all of that waste is not being, all of the rest of it, right? The rest of that 86% of the food waste, but then also all the other farms that are not recycling their manure and all the wastewater facilities that aren't recycling their sludge and the landfills that aren't beneficially reusing their gas, that all represents not recycling, which represents greenhouse gas emissions and represents an opportunity to have a really positive impact on the climate if we can actually do something beneficial. So the monetization of the CO2 is a really important part of that equation because now you maybe can start accessing hundreds and hundreds of new projects that might not pencil out otherwise because they're too small and they're not generating enough revenue from the methane only. So you add revenue from the methane and revenue from the CO2. Now that creates a lot of economic and environmental opportunities, and that would be really exciting for all of us.
Yeah, I look at it, two different ways because I 100% agree with everything you just said. And the as a country, we are a net exporter of natural gas, and all of that natural gas, with the exception of this methane that we're capturing that you just noted, is coming from fossil fuels. It's coming from the fracking when we're pumping oil out of the ground. We're also taking this natural gas. We're burning that natural gas, and we're releasing CO2 with it. But we also have all of this waste, all these landfills and farm waste and whatever that is also releasing naturally the CO2 into the environment. Over time, long term, the more value and volume we get in capturing the CO2 off of these existing methane capture facilities, the less reliant we are on natural gas from the ground. So, of those 15, let's just say we could add those 15,000, facilities, what percentage of the U.S. demand for natural gas today would that encompass? A rough estimate. I know that's obviously a tough number to come up with.
Well,
But
you may be disappointed to hear that it would still be a pretty small number of the natural gas use, but that has very little to do with the biogas industry and everything to do with how much natural gas we use in the United States. And part of that is good news. I mean, usually we see lots of fossil, we talk about lots of fossil fuel use, and generally that's seen as a negative thing, and there are definitely negative parts of that. But part of the reason that natural gas use is so prevalent right now is because we have actually taken a lot of coal power plants and other dirtier sources, even oil, the hydrocarbons that have a lot more carbon and a lot less hydrogen in them, right? Your coals, your oils. We've taken a lot of those facilities for energy use offline over the last decade or so, and it's been replaced with cleaner natural gas. And so now what we need to do is we need to continue that trend of decarbonizing, right? That is literal decarbonization, right? When you look at a hydrocarbon, that's hydrogen and carbon, moving from coal to oil uh, is less carbon and more hydrogen in that oil molecule. And moving from oil to natural gas is less carbon and more hydrogen. So we're doing less carbon, less carbon, less carbon. And now what we're talking about is going from conventional fossil natural gas to renewable natural gas. Okay, that is the same hydrocarbon, but what you've done is you've taken that hydrocarbon that was already going into the atmosphere and you've stopped it from going into the atmosphere. And so even when you use it, now when you use it, you're generating CO2 as an emission. But from a global warming perspective, you have made a huge net improvement because methane is 10 to 80 times, depending upon what your time scale is, 10 to 80 times worse for global warming than methane is. So you've stopped methane emissions from going to the atmosphere almost totally, and you replace them with a very small amount of CO2. That's a net positive. So even the move from fossil natural gas to renewable natural gas is a massive reduction in carbon also. And then if we can kind of keep going further and you take the natural gas and you maybe make hydrogen from it, and now there's zero carbon, so we can still keep going on this trend. And, that's all on the energy side. But there's a parallel with CO2 because we can do the same thing with CO2. We can take CO2 that's had a carbon footprint from extracting it from the ground, and now take CO2 that was previously being vented, because that's really what's happening right now, to all the CO2 that you have in the biogas that is going into the atmosphere. Why don't we beneficially reuse that and replace other conventionally sourced CO2? These are all the steps that we need to take to be more environmentally responsible with our energy and with our resources. And biogas systems are a huge part of that. It's just funny because most people don't know what it is. It's like one of the oldest things ever, right? The microbes that are in biogas systems are literally the oldest microbes in the entire universe. This has actually been happening since the beginning of time. But what we're talking about is optimizing these natural systems with some engineering. And now, when you look at organic waste going in and biogas coming out, and then your nutrients coming out with your liquids and solids, now it's a matter of like full recycling. How much can we use all of the gas product? Let's use all of it. Let's find a way to use all of it. And how do we use all the liquid and the solid product as usually a fertilizer? And so this is the missing element, because the solids and the liquids coming out of a biogas system are really easy to be able to reuse and replace fertilizer, fossil generated fertilizer, to make our soils healthier. Okay, great. Liquids and solids, check. Gas is the biogas. We're beneficially reusing the methane, check. What is left? It is the CO2. Let's figure that out. Let's build that market for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, really well articulated.
Absolutely,
right
yeah.
there.
No, that's
a great description, Patrick. I mean, walk through
yeah.
it.
One of the largest food processors, meat processors, has a saying that in their beef production that I equate to a lot of these farms and landfills, but they like to say we use everything but the moo.
And they're trying to figure out how to use
We'll
that.
take the poo.
I don't know if I can do that one, but yeah, I mean, and we've been to some of these biogas facilities, and it's amazing the ingenuity of what we think is all these farmers. But they are entrepreneurial, they are smart, and they are trying to use everything, whether it's produced fertilizer. Can you capture that carbon, make carbon black, and put it into rubber or polymers or other things? Can we make ethanol out of it? You take the methane and the CO2 and make hydrogen, or you can make sustainable aviation fuels. You can do all sorts of things once you get it down to carbon and hydrogen, which is what we have. And so, yeah, obviously it needs to be cost effective, and we're slowly getting there. But the more our sources, to kind of spin this back to CO2, the more our sources of CO2 are getting constrained or at risk off of an ethanol plant that might sequester that CO2 because it's such high volumes and there's huge tax credits to do such. We need alternative sources of CO2. So maybe let's shift gears and let's talk about that. We met you at ISBT a few months ago, and you gave a presentation there, but there was a whole day and a half of CO2 symposium. Most of the conversation was about biogenic CO2 and its approval as a source gas for beverage grade CO2. Can we consume this biogenic CO2?
And with that, to the levels of the feedstock, I think that's important to note. As we see pushback, maybe we can consume biogenic CO2, but it cannot come from landfill right now. It can come from dairy waste, or I'd like to unpack the feedstocks along with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you know that there are more considerations just than where it comes from, right? Because I guess it is from where they come from, not just the source in terms of its carbon profile, but also what else might be in the gas and how do you clean it up to different grades of CO2? That's an important piece of the puzzle too. I think the opportunity here is we've got some of the traditional sources of biogenic CO2 potentially disappearing, and that creates an opportunity for biogas systems, which are probably going to be a little bit lower volume compared to like an ethanol plant in terms of the CO2 that we're producing. Not all the time, but in most cases. But these biogas systems are everywhere because they're everywhere where the people and the animals are. And so that distributed nature of the CO2, I think that creates an opportunity because CO2 is really expensive to move, or you lose a lot when you try to move it. And so having sources of CO2 where you need it, I think that's one advantage. When you look at a map of the biogas systems all around the U.S., you see the entire U.S. covered, all 50 states, and that's even only with the 2,300 that we have built already. And that's because the biogas systems are where the people and the animals are, and it's hard to pick. It's hard to point your finger to a map of the U.S. and not be pointing to where there's people or animals, because we have that everywhere. So yeah, I think there's going to be a good opportunity as there's more interest in getting CO2 from biogas systems. But I think it's going to have to come from both sides, because I think on the biogas industry side, the industry at large is generally um, uneducated about the CO2 market. And so we have to make that connection to the biogas industry, and love to help you with that. It's part of why I'm glad to be talking with you, because we need to make that connection. And then the other side of it is obviously, helping the CO2 market to understand, okay, well, what can biogas systems do and what can't they do, or where are the costs and benefits? And I think as we close that gap and get the two groups talking to each other, we're going to find the best economic opportunities to do the next several plants. And then people are going to see, yeah, okay, this just makes sense. I'm already making this product. Um, Let me stop venting it and try to get it to a form that a customer wants to buy it and then sell it.
Yeah, no, that we've been saying for several years now, that it's the CO2 in the U.S. is a cheap, abundant gas. It's always been the dirty, cheap gas that nobody cared that much about. Even a lot of the industrial major gas companies aren't even involved in CO2 or nominally involved, but they're much more interested now, and everybody else is as well, because while it's still abundant off of an ethanol plant today, we can capture 5 times as much as we do today if we wanted to. There's not enough market for it. But as we start sequestering that in larger volumes, or sending it down to maybe more profitable ventures like sustainable aviation fuel or things like that, the cheap, abundant supply of CO2 isn't cheap and abundant anymore. As we continue on, that's going to continuously change, and that's making all of these other concepts and sources much more viable ultimately. So,
And then add to that the change in demand, and not necessarily even speaking to the increase of demand, but where people are willing to source CO2 from.
Yeah.
So as you have these new products and technologies for sustainable aviation fuels, they don't want to source CO2 from the underground well. They want to source it from a biogenic source. It doesn't fit in the model of their business to use non-biogenic CO2. But a lot of those new developments are at pilot stage. So it's just the profile of the CO2 required for the output of whatever their product will be from your traditional sources. I can't take it off of an ammonia plant. I think it needs to come from the circular economy. I think we'll see a lot of that.
I think so. I'm sure you're well aware of it and have dealt with the mostly it's the beverage industry that has the biggest concern at the ISBT of that perception of where that CO2 came from, and nobody ever wants to be the one that says we had dirty CO2 because your soda is produced by something that came from a landfill or from a cow waste. Nobody wants to see that headline, and I totally understand that, but my counter argument is always pretty simple. Did you want to know that it came from a chemical plant or an ammonia plant? Do you really know where your CO2 comes from today? The answer is no. And I agree, especially with younger generations that have a much more keen sense of all of this. They want to know that it's a circular. They actually want to know that we've captured the CO2 and integrated in.
Put that faith into the consumer.
Absolutely.
As perception is changing, so is ideals or values, and that actually matters. I mean, I think we get a pickup there.
Absolutely. I think somebody's going to win. And I to go back just a little bit. I mean, you noted about that, that kind of regional, smaller volume, regional distribution model of CO2. I 100% believe we will get there. As the price of CO2 increases, it makes those kind of ideas more profitable. But it's also going to be extremely disruptive if ethanol plants do start going offline. If ammonia plants, shut down completely, all we have to do is look at Europe and see what happened 10, 15 years ago in Europe and where they are today on biogenic CO2 and RNG relative to where we are. And they're a good 3 to 5 years ahead of us in that regard because they don't have the CO2 that we have. So as our sources start to go away, then those are going to come way more
I
viable.
wonder if we can take a page in terms of like the marketing and the branding of this. I wonder if we can take a page from like the plastics recycling industry or some of the textile recycling industries where they've said like, hey, this thing is made from recycled plastic or recycled materials, right? And as you're drinking a beverage, to say like, hey, the bubbles in this is recycled CO2. And then we don't need to talk about like source. We're just talking about it being recycled, right? And I would drink that.
That's 100%. Somebody's gonna finally make that move. I'm not sure which one. I can guess which one, but I'm not. I'm not gonna say who I would think. But yeah, somebody's gonna make that decision and have a marketable advantage for some amount of time. That exactly what you just said. Like this is you could paint the other guy as that's a fossil fuel based soda you're drinking. It's like if you really want to go that far. Now that's not 100% because most of it's not coming from fossil fuels, obviously, but a lot of it is coming from ethanol production, which is theoretically a biogenic type of CO2 in itself. And it has a lower carbon footprint than alternative sources of CO2. But nevertheless, I mean, I think there's, if somebody could spin that message really well, I think they'll get some buy-in in this market for sure.
Yeah, and you have to assume, I mean, we've seen it with some of our partners that have been on the podcast, looking to do direct air capture, and they're looking for outlet of the CO2. Not everybody in that space is looking to sequester. I imagine because they do want to have the messaging of CO2 came from the air. Same concept with this biogas CO2, just a different perception. Education is important, and I guess that leads me to a question. Patrick, I think 2 years ago when we first attended the Biogas Americas conference, the stat was that attendance was doubling year over year, and I believe that happened again this year. And I wonder, who are the stakeholders there? Are you starting to see the consumers of CO2, those beverage companies, showing up to be educated on the CO2 side, coming to an R&D conference, but for information on where CO2 may be sourced from?
We're starting to see it. I mean, I think there's already a connection between the biogas industry and the beverage industry on the waste side. Because if you can take, most beverage manufacturers, a lot of food manufacturers too, have a wastewater associated with them. And that wastewater often has a lot of sugar in it or other things that have energy in it. So the opportunity, I know a lot of breweries are doing it already. Anheuser-Busch, Magic Hat, Sierra Nevada, they all have their own biogas systems at their facilities already to be able to handle their wastewater and then provide energy back to the plant. And so it was interesting when we had one of those big beverage manufacturers come to some of our members recently. I was getting this story from one of our members who makes biogas systems, and they were saying, "Hey, I was talking to this huge beverage company," and I was like, "Oh, that's so great! Are they building new biogas systems?" And the answer was, "Well, maybe," but they wanted to talk to me about biogenic CO2. And not the biogas part of it. That is where that connection already is. And so for the beverage industry, I mean, it just makes so much sense because now it's just like we talked about earlier, right? It's using all the products. So look at it from the beverage manufacturing facility. Take all the waste, recycle that, turn it into things that the facility actually needs. And again, CO2 is one of those missing. It's the gap in the puzzle, right? A lot of the rest of the puzzle has already been put together, but then there's that one gap, and it's the CO2 piece that needs to go in there to help complete it and have a more circular solution.
Like we see it, especially in South America, places where CO2 is harder to source, where they're using the fermentation process for CO2. And as we talk about the different feedstocks, maybe jumping straight to landfill is too much of a discomfort for people. But the concept of, well, we've seen fermentation work for a source of CO2. Let's capture off the wastewater, closed loop, but you talk about the sugars that you're taking from your process. It's essentially the same step where you know where that CO2 is coming from, you know what makes up that waste profile. We prove that concept, we show to the public we can absolutely achieve a level of specification that is the standard across the board, and then we can roll that to different feedstocks within the biogenic CO2 umbrella.
Yep. Well, you talk about wastewater. If you take CO2 and you put it into discharge water, it lowers the pH. So if you have a discharge permit and you have high pH, you can use that CO2, not chemicals, to lower the pH. So you can be capturing your own CO2 off of your wastewater and put it back into your system. That's full cycle right there. And you're eliminating the use of chemicals that are going into our streams, our rivers, our oceans, and things like that. So all sorts of great opportunities in all of that. And yeah, so as Luke noted, we just walked the show, attended the show last year in Chicago, and we were just fascinated with it. It was great. This year we exhibited it, and we were overwhelmed with the inquiries about CO2 capture and liquefaction, biogenic CO2. I'm trying to use it. What do I? The biggest question is always, well, what do I do with it? I can capture it all day long. What do I do with it? And that's where we focus a lot of our effort on, is how do we build this marketplace for these regional smaller volumes of CO2 and make it cost competitive and viable. There is a business model there. It's going to take some time to kind of get there, but the more disruptions in the market that we see, and the more units that do go offline, if more pipelines that come online, it's going to make all of this more viable. And the ones that think about it ahead of time and now and are putting shovels in the ground on some of these biogas projects, they're going to be the ones that win ultimately. It's just that I think the whole model changes, from what it looks like today.
Shovels in the ground. I mean, 5 today, 17,000 sites. The backlog is going to be just. There will be pain for those that don't move.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Huge upside, for those that are fortunate.
And there could be brand new players in the market because the rest of us couldn't get out of our own way. I talk about that all the time from the innovator's dilemma aspect of it. Like they have a set. Nothing's changed in the CO2 distribution market in 50 years. Very little has anyway. This could really disrupt it. And can we get out of our own way and accept that disruption or and be a part of it, or do we just slowly die on the vine?
I love that you got so much out of coming to Biogas Americas, because I think that's where this all starts. Not necessarily our event, although we do think it's a pretty awesome event and has been growing like crazy, but the education part of it, right? Like people who coming to shows and to talk to people who they might not have talked to otherwise, and learning about the other side of it. I think that is the key to this moving ahead. I mean, we talked about it earlier, right? It's the biogas systems learning, or biogas developers learning more about the CO2 market, and the CO2 producers and users learning more about the biogas market. And we'd love to help facilitate that. We'll be in Denver next April and May, and we'll be in St. Louis at the end of October at Business of Biogas. And so plenty of opportunity there. Actually, this is a totally shameless plug, but we are going to have a CO2 session. We are going to have a CO2 session at the Business of Biogas. So October 22 to 24. And it's developed with some of your colleagues. So it's because we really believe that there's an opportunity here. So we need to talk about it. We're trying to create that opportunity.
And Patrick, I mean, I can't go a day, seriously, without receiving an email or a phone call about what to do with CO2 off of a biogas facility or a prospective biogas facility, and we have the same message. Get to some of these shows, talk to some of the adjacent, the learning that can be done in a short amount of time. I think the investment there is so worth it to attend and walk these shows.
I agree.
Because we get to make these connections, and now that final piece of the puzzle, we all start to work together to place it. And so we found a ton of benefit in it. I encourage other people that are reaching out to us to experience and educate themselves, use the resources available. So no shameless plug there.
No, it's a benefit.
Put my stamp on that.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's been a great event the 2 times we've attended so far, and like I say, it just keeps growing and getting bigger, and then the networking and the understanding, because a lot of people in the CO2 world might not think about it's biogas, it's RNG. But that last time, there was people talking wind and solar and renewables. There's people that understand tax credits and how that all works, and RINs and LCAs and all of that will ultimately all apply to CO2, biogenic, carbon capture, you name it. So, great resource for all of that.
Thanks. I hope we'll see you guys there.
We will, absolutely, Patrick. And with that, let's just tell the audience, where can they find you, and what should they be reaching out to you for? How can you help further move the needle here?
Yeah, you can just search for biogas. I'm pretty sure we're going to show up. But we're American Biogas Council.org. And come check out Biogas America's Business of Biogas. We have a lot of resources for people to learn about the industry, and we'd love to help you and help the CO2 industry. And yeah, let's connect more dots here and complete more circles and complete more puzzles in terms of our circular economy. And that is what this is all about.
Thanks,
Outstanding.
Patrick. Yeah,
We
we'll
really
see you in
appreciate it.
October.
Awesome.
Take care,
See you
sir.
guys soon.